Well, good morning. Today we're going to talk a little bit about something called the residual claimant. A residual claimant in a free market is the factor of production who has the sole claim on a firm or an organization's net cash flow. Put it another way, they bear the burden, they bear the risk of any losses that a firm may incur. Now, the idea of the residual claimant has been around for a while in economics. It started with a guy named Francis Walker back in 1875. Walker proposes that the four factors of production, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, should all get paid something. Now, that's not all that unusual. But what Walker suggested was that only three of the factors should get paid a regular amount, and that the fourth factor of production should receive any residuals, anything left over after the sales were completed. Now, Walker gave some specifics about what each factor of production should be paid. Capital should get interest, land should get rent, laborers should get wages, and the entrepreneur should get the profits. Those are just the names of the payments to each one of those factors of production. But Walker did a pretty strange thing. He looked at the factors of production and he decided that the landlord should get paid. Those are the owners of the land. Decided that the owners of the capital should get paid. And he decided that the entrepreneur should get paid. So Walker made the residual claimant labor. Now, this is kind of an odd thing because it violates the idea of the subjective value of the output, and instead said that the output itself should be valued based on how much work and how much effort is put into creating it. And we talked a little bit about this through the perspective of what Karl Marx said, and basically what Walker is saying is akin to what Marx was saying. But interestingly, it's also similar to what Adam Smith said about the value of labor. What makes this really curious is that it assumes that the entrepreneur doesn't really have that big of a role to play in determining value and determining what should be produced and how much should be earned for the things that are produced. This presumes that the entrepreneur only bears a minimal risk in the production process, and that any additional value that's generated through the production process that's attributable to output should come strictly through labor. For Walker, any of the factors of production could have worked here. It didn't have to be labor, but that's the one that he went with, as he described this idea of residual claimancy. Currently, though, in the kind of the modern economic world, the residual claimancy is attributable to the entrepreneur. It's the entrepreneur who seems to bear more of the risk of production than any of the other factors. The entrepreneur can hire labor at a predetermined wage, and as we talked about when we talked a little bit about Marx, that's a voluntary agreement. So why things should be attributable to labor is kind of still a mystery. And we've moved the attribution of residual claimancy to the risk taker, to the entrepreneur. And of course, that has implications for economic activity, because now what we're doing is we're providing the entrepreneur more of an incentive to engage in certain kinds of behaviors. This is important, of course, because free markets generate incentives. And when you alter the incentives, you alter the outcomes. And sometimes those outcomes are not what you predicted would happen in the first place. Sometimes those outcomes yield less productivity. So let's take a look at an example of how changing the residual claimant can change the incentives of behavior. We're going to take a look at a very specific industry, one that unfortunately isn't going on right now. That is the sports industry. Specifically, who owns a particular stadium, and then follow that up with, why does that even matter? Before we get into the specifics on sports stadiums, I want to review a particular idea that we talked about a number of weeks ago, the idea of a public good. Remember, when we look at public goods, we said that they have two characteristics. One is that they're non-rival in consumption, which means that once a good is being consumed, it can be consumed by a number of other people at the same time without diminishing anybody's enjoyment of that good. The other characteristic is that they're non-excludable, meaning that you can't keep people from using this good even if it isn't paid for. Now, these two characteristics are necessary if you have what's called a pure public good. A pure public good will have both of these characteristics, but not all goods are pure public goods when it comes to the context of public goods. One of the other things we need to note about public goods is that these are goods where there is a profit opportunity, but because of these two characteristics, a private firm doesn't undertake that profit opportunity. So these two characteristics make it impossible, or at least make it very unlikely, that a profit can be generated. Now, that doesn't mean that people don't want the public good. In fact, most of the time, people still do want the public good. They just don't want to pay for it, because there's also that notion of the free rider problem. Because of the free rider problem, because people can get the good without paying for it, businesses aren't inclined to buy this, to produce this particular good. Public goods as a whole are goods that people indicate that they want, but the private sector doesn't provide them, so that leaves the door open for the public sector to provide public goods. The public sector provision of a public good is something that we're pretty familiar with. We see the public sector, the government, provide lots of things. We will talk about national defense. We might talk about highways. We might talk about things like schools. But what we start to see is that the more things we list, the public sector providing, the less stable the idea of a public good becomes. National defense is an example that we give of a pure public good. It's a good people want. It's a good that's virtually impossible to keep people from using, even if they don't pay. And everybody can use this good at the same time without diminishing anybody's enjoyment of it. But if we look at something like a highway, we run into some problems here. Government provides highways. People want highways. People can get on the highway without paying for it. But highways are certainly not non-rival in consumption. They are very much rival in consumption. And if you don't believe me, try driving down the Parkway West almost at any time of the day. They're rival in consumption, and we can see that through the idea of traffic congestion or traffic jams. When somebody else is using the highway, it does inhibit our enjoyment of it. It is not a pure public good. And a similar thing with schools. Can you keep people from using a school even if they don't pay? Absolutely. Schools are very clearly excludable. We expel people all the time. We put people in out of school detention. And they're rival in consumption, because if you put too many kids in a classroom, it inhibits the enjoyment, or at least the benefit that comes from being in school. Defense is a pure public good, but neither highways nor schools are pure public goods. Yet governments provide them anyway. These are what we refer to as quasi-public goods. A quasi-public good is a good that's provided by government, but only has one or perhaps none of the characteristics that a pure public good would have. And highways, and certainly schools, and housing, and healthcare, and sports stadiums all fit the bill here. These are goods that are provided by government, but goods that don't have the characteristics of a pure public good. So that brings us to the sports stadium. Who owns a stadium and why would it matter? Well, think about it more in terms of the construction costs. Stadiums are huge costs to a team. Stadiums are enormous fixed costs for any professional team. Whether you're talking about baseball teams, basketball teams, even NASCAR, the stadiums are fixed costs. And because of those fixed costs, teams are going to have to find some way to have a consistent revenue stream to cover those fixed costs. They can't really shut down. They can't just eliminate their variable costs because they're part of a league. Being part of a league makes them a special kind of business. So they can't just shut down like, say, a restaurant. The stadiums are these fixed costs, and sometimes they're exorbitant. And the team doesn't want to pay those things. And if they can get somebody else to pay them, then perhaps they can. That's going to alter their business plan. For example, one of the more expensive stadiums in recent memory is the Marlins Stadium. Marlins are the professional baseball team that plays in Miami. At the time it was built, it cost $634 million, of which the public paid $488 million. So $488 million of that stadium came through taxes. On the football side, we could look at a stadium, Paul Brown Stadium, which is where the Bengals play, the Cincinnati football team. The estimated final cost of that stadium was $1.1 billion. Almost all of it came from taxpayers. We can look at the Nationals Park for the Washington Nationals, the team that most recently won the World Series in baseball. And that stadium was built at a relatively modest $693 million. All of it taxpayer funded. We can even look at the local team, the Pittsburgh Pirates at PNC Park. This was actually a reasonably priced stadium at $216 million, relatively reasonable. All of it paid by taxpayers, but don't worry, the Pirates do pay a little bit. They pay $100,000 per year in rent. These stadiums are enormously expensive. And the similarity between these four particular stadiums, at least for this team, and this team, is that all three of them absolutely stink. The residual claimant, the factor of production, collects any residuals from the production process, is either going to be the team owner or the city. The city provides the stadium. The city puts up the money for the fixed costs. It's not the city who collects any revenues from this. They're just bearing this enormous cost. So how do you think the behavior would be different depending upon who owns the stadiums? I mean, think about it. If the team owner owned the stadium, if they had to pony up all that money, how do you think their approach to putting a product on the field would differ as opposed to a team that doesn't have to pay for that fixed cost of the stadium? So let's take a look just kind of anecdotally at two different stadiums. In 2000, the year 2000, the San Francisco Giants moved into their new baseball stadium, and they paid the full cost of that. A year later, the Pittsburgh Pirates moved into PNC Park, and they paid none of that. In that time, or since that time, the Giants have been to 4 World Series and won 3. And of course, the Pirates have been to none. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that if you build a new stadium, you're going to put a better product on the field. But there is some empirical evidence that suggests that maybe you actually will. Because who's the residual claimant? Who bears the burden of failure in these cases? If you don't bear the burden of failure, then perhaps your incentive structure changes somewhat. A team who has say a $500 million bill that they have to pay, consider how they might approach putting a team together. If a significant portion of their revenues come through putting people in the seats, then you want to make sure you have a winning product on the field. In other words, your profit maximizing strategy has to take into consideration paying this enormous bill. But if you don't have to worry about that, then your profit maximizing strategy might look at saving money on the cost side, say by not putting the best players that you can together to form your team. If the city bears the burden of the stadium, then that changes the incentive structure tremendously for the team owner. Since you don't necessarily have to win to make money, you might satisfy or at least kind of placate your fan base by telling them what a great experience it is to come to the stadium rather than come and watch our winning team. The great thing about this is that it's really an empirical question. We can collect data and try to figure out whether or not there's a clear and noticeable difference in the performance of teams who play in publicly owned stadiums versus privately owned stadiums. There's been lots of research into the role of residual claimancy in the decision-making process for economic agents. And research shows that making economic agents the residual claimant creates some remarkable incentives. And by economic agents, what I really mean here is the entrepreneur. If the entrepreneur isn't the residual claimant, so let's say here is our entrepreneur, and they would like to have access to these big piles of money that they can earn through profits. But if they're not, then this person is likely to just kind of flake out. This person will continue at doing what they're doing, but their alertness, their level of alertness falls. They're not looking for opportunities to make that money. They're not looking for new and better ways to do things. Their incentives to discover valuable information about their opportunities is diminished because this isn't an opportunity for them. Residual claimancy, however, also impacts how much depreciation occurs in a physical asset. So let's say we have an owner of a building here. And so there's maybe renters who live in this building. But if the entrepreneur, if the owner of the building here, so here's our building owner, if they can't collect the residual claimancy, if they can't collect any residuals from the good things that they do to this building, then it seems to be the case, at least based on research, that the buildings, that the physical property depreciates much more quickly, and things are not kept up as effectively. So maybe the window breaks and or cracks, and we don't repair it right away, and maybe we get some water damage, but the owner doesn't have any incentive really to keep the building up because they're not allowed to hold those residuals. There tends to be a lot more investment. There tends to be a lot more investment in the physical property than when you're the owner as opposed to when you're the renter. So let's say instead of the owner owning the building, let's say that the owner has a house of their own, and something breaks, the window cracks or whatever. Now the owner says, well, we got to get that fixed quickly because this is my property and I want to be able to sell it in the future. So the owner tends to keep these things up. So the things that you own, you keep up. The things that you are, if you're a renter, so here's somebody who's renting here, then this person has much less incentive to keep up. Because they don't have any claim to any residuals that would take place. So this person might put some flowers in, they have some curb appeal, maybe they add on to the house at some point. So they put another wing to the house over here because they get to recoup any financial gains from what they're doing to the property. So how is this related to winning in sports? Well, research done on professional baseball from 1887 to 1997, so over 100 years, showed that teams in privately owned stadiums win more. In fact, they would win almost 12 and a half more games per year in a privately owned stadium. That's pretty significant. I mean, that's going to lead to far more opportunities to be in the playoffs, far more opportunities to win championships. And the rationale behind this, why you might do this, is that if you lose as an owner of the stadium, then your revenue falls. Losing causes fans to stop attending. Fans like winning teams. And then revenue falls. And this impacts your ability to pay your talent and to pay your mortgage. And you might think, well, okay, 1887 to 1997, if you know anything about baseball, you say, well, the New York Yankees were one of the dominant teams over this time period. And indeed, Yankee Stadium was privately owned for a good bit of this time. But so were stadiums like Fenway Park for the Red Sox and Wrigley Field for the Chicago Cubs. And those two teams were awful during this time period. So it's not skewed necessarily by one team. We're looking at all of the teams in all of the stadiums over 100 years, and the result is more winning for teams in privately owned stadiums. So if we go back in time, we see that teams in old stadiums, teams who played with gloves like this one, nice 5-fingered glove, some of those teams had privately owned stadiums and some of them had publicly owned stadiums. But over time, what we see is that the teams who are most successful in professional baseball over this long, long period of time, played in privately owned stadiums. Now, the question is, why would you ever, if you're going to be successful, why would you ever want a city to um, pay for your stadium? And the answer is because if someone's going to give you a $600 million place to play your games, why wouldn't you take it? But that gets us back to one of the main points of residual claimancy, and that is it can certainly change your incentives to perform. The profit maximizing motive changes if you don't have this enormous fixed cost to cover. One of the arguments that's made on the part of stadium advocates is that by putting a new stadium in place, it's going to generate a lot of activity in your town. You want to have a professional sports team in town because that's going to draw people into town who wouldn't normally come. It's going to there's going to be kind of these peripheral businesses, bars and restaurants that are part of this stadium experience. Interestingly, that argument has been largely debunked by researchers who look at the amount of economic activity that happens when a stadium is when a new stadium or when a team is in town, as opposed to what happens when a team isn't there. So the idea of residual claimancy and the idea of using public dollars to build any kind of an arena is really a specious one. It's one that sounds good on the surface, but it typically doesn't lead to more wins for your team. It may, on occasion, there may be the one-off, like the Nationals. But there are teams like the Seattle Mariners, the Seattle baseball team, who've never been to a World Series and who have always played in in publicly owned stadiums. In fact, the Mariners are one of the only teams to never have made the World Series. And it's not that they haven't had good teams in the past, but it may be because they have played in stadiums that haven't given them the right incentive to perform. In free markets, we know that profits send signals. And when you start to interrupt those signaling mechanisms, and one of the ways you can interrupt that signaling mechanism is to alter the cost structure for an organization, then that interruption of the profit signal leads to incentives that lead to outcomes that we may not want to have. It may lead to outcomes like terrible baseball teams in Pittsburgh for the foreseeable future. Even though they have a really great stadium